As you might imagine, when I write up an episode of Esoterica, I often end up not including everything I could possibly cover. There are always tidbits of interesting things that I wish I could mention but have to pass over for whatever reason. And I try to keep track of those little fragments of things so that I can either build them out into full episodes of their own at some point, but often they just become lost fragments. So to use those fragments, I'm going to start making little episodes like this one that are just sort of Esoterica Fragmenta as extra content. So not a full episode, there'll be a full episode coming on this Sunday, but hopefully some interesting fragments today on the early persecution of alchemy and on the structure of medieval necromancy. While working on the recent episode on Cleopatra the Alchemist, I came across a fascinating remark about what may be the earliest recorded persecution of alchemy. The remark reads in full, "Alchemy, the production of gold and silver, Diocletian, having sought out the books on this subject, burned them. Now, because of the revolutions, Diocletian treated the Egyptians harshly and cruelly, and having sought out the books written by their forefathers on the alchemy of gold and silver, burned them, lest wealth should accrue to the Egyptians through this art, and lest they should become emboldened by their riches, and should in the future again revolt against the Romans." Now, this fragment is really interesting in many ways. The first is that it's an early witness to the connection of ancient Egypt with alchemy and the production of gold and silver. Of course, as I've pointed out in other episodes, we already have that connection in the alchemical literature itself, but here we have it from a Roman imperial perspective. Further, the concern here is that the Egyptians might employ alchemy to enrich themselves and again revolt against the Roman Empire. This may also help to date this fragment to the 290s when Diocletian put down a rebellion there in Egypt. Further, we should also put this persecution of the alchemists of Egypt into the larger economic situation of the Roman economy at that time. The most important thing to know at this time period, by the late 3rd century, is about the virtual collapse of the value of the denarius. There's a huge problem in Roman currency, specifically the rise of rapid inflation and the debasement of the currency. And Diocletian is known for his currency reforms. Further, and perhaps more famously, it was during Diocletian's rulership that there was, as I pointed out, rampant inflation and currency debasement, which led to, I think, the most famous decree of his time period, and probably one of the best preserved imperial decrees of the Roman Empire, the Edictum de Praetiis Rerum Venalium, or the Edict on the Maximum Prices, which fixed the prices of dozens of domestic staples. This gives us a really great insight into how much things cost in the Roman Empire. No doubt, his attack on the alchemists in the late 3rd century should be set against the larger precious metal and coinage situation in the Roman Empire more generally. And the worry here is rather clear, and it becomes somewhat perennial in the history of alchemy. The ability to create gold and silver would, in fact, threaten the very economic structure of basically any pre-modern society. And this leads to a kind of curious dialectic in alchemical practice. On the one hand, every ruler wants a successful court alchemist because they realize that having infinite amounts of gold and silver is the best. But they also realize the danger of such a success. Thus, alchemy is never really persecuted like witchcraft or magic, but the practice is viewed with both the hope for riches, but also the threat of larger economic collapse. In fact, this will all really come to a head centuries later during the late medieval precious metal famine, a period that, unsurprisingly, also saw the greatest output of alchemical publications. In fact, there's a very strong correlation between precious metal famines more generally and alchemical publications all through European history. The business and economics of alchemy is actually just another really big topic that will at some point become at least a few episodes on its own. But regardless, this is an interesting glimpse into Roman imperial policy vis-a-vis alchemy at the very apex of alchemical practice in ancient Egypt and very nearly contemporary to the lifetimes of such famous alchemists as Miriam Hebrea, Cleopatra, and Zosimus. Now, from alchemy to necromancy, as we're wont to do around these parts. While working on the episode on the Cambridge Necromancer's Manual, there's a really great discussion about the structure of medieval necromantic ritual, but I just didn't have the time to go into it, so the structure of medieval necromancy. While the rituals of many medieval texts can appear rather haphazard, even full of seemingly random elements, there is very often a rather tight structure underlying these rituals. This fourfold structure has been discovered by Kieckhefer and follows a fourfold progression: the declaration, the address, the invocations, and the instruction. The declaration usually takes the form of a magical verb, I conjure, conjuro, or exorcizo, I exorcise, and it is followed by the address, or the name of the entity or subject of the magical working. The address can be anything from a spiritual creature, an angel, or a demon, and it can even be something like a thief or even a root, as we saw in the Valerian root conjuration in the Cambridge Manual. Following the address, there is a series of invocations, which are almost always adjurations, by which the magical experiment is given supernatural force. These very often include one of 9 categories: God, sacred names for God or Christ specifically, events from the life of Christ, the saints and the martyrs, the Virgin Mary, angels, other powerful creatures, the final judgment, or the names of other demons, often more powerful demons than the one you're trying to summon. This section is very clearly derived from the larger body of medieval Catholic exorcistic rituals. If you recall the scene from The Exorcist where they're chanting over and over again, "The power of Christ compels you," or "The blood of the martyrs compel you," while performing that exorcism on Reagan, this will all sound really familiar, even with the modern Roman ritual of exorcism. By basically cajoling the spirits by using other more powerful metaphysical entities, the necromancer can thus magically force them into their service. Finally, the fourth part is the instruction, or just what the spell or magical experiment is meant to do, or what the spirit is to carry out on the part of the necromancer. This, of course, can be anything from erotic binding, conjurations of spirits for interrogation about the future, or, most importantly, of course, the location of buried treasure. This fourfold structure is nearly ubiquitous through medieval necromancy, and it gives us a peek into just how magic practitioners structured their rituals and the underlying logic of how they thought magic worked more generally. So, a somewhat briefer Esoterica Fragmenta episode. Make sure to check out the cards during this episode to catch larger episodes on the topics we've discussed. And if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, or Kabbalah, make sure to subscribe. You can check out my numerous other content on topics in esotericism, magic, Kabbalah, and the occult. And if you want to support my work of making this kind of content accessible and freely available here on YouTube, maybe you consider supporting me on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thanks for hanging out with me here on Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.